Thank you, Irina Irinida. My name is David Molina. I'll be the chair of the opening panel of today's conference on the census. So without further ado, our first panelist this morning is Lida Oukaderova. Lida Oukaderova is an associate professor of film studies at Rice University. She's the author of the book, The Cinema of the Soviet Thought, Space, Materiality, and Movement, which pursues close readings of key films of the period in the context of contemporaneous spatial developments, including shifts in architecture and urban planning, a developing interest in urban mobility, new pushes to conquer nature, and the gender-driven organization of private and public environments. The book examines films by Kalatozov, Danelia, Muratova, Shepitka, and also includes chapters about critical debates surrounding Soviet panoramic cinema. Lida is currently working on a book preliminarily titled Ethics, Humanism, Form, Soviet and Post-Soviet Cinema since the 1960s, looking at how the material conditions of film allow for diverse forms of ethical thinking during the late Soviet and post-Soviet period. Muratova's work is certainly a part of this book, and her talk today is devoted to one of the most elusive of Muratova films, Second Class Citizens. Its title, Kira Muratova's Second Class Citizens and the Aesthetics of Collage. Lida, you have the floor. Thank you for speaking to us today.
Okay, thank you, David, for this introduction. I didn't know that it was the most elusive of Muratova's film, but okay. And thank you, Irina and Irina, for this wonderful conference. It's been so far an incredibly rich experience. And I should also say that this talk is very much part of a project in gestation. And so as I kept working on it, it evolved and slightly shifted in focus. So rather than talking about the aesthetics of collage, I will be talking about collecting. So the two obviously have something in common. They're all about putting things together, but the artistic practice of collage for now is not really part of this talk. Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see it? Okay, so it goes here. Muratova's 2001 film Второстепенные люди, Secondary People, concludes with a series of images from a private collection of a sort. We see here one of the protagonists, Misha, sitting on his bed in a mental institution, which is his home, flipping through his album of collected items. One by one, the album's pages appear on screen in a full frontal view with close-ups of extremely diverse objects, including scratched postcards of Beatles, as you see here, torn up and worn out images of dolls, old black and white photographs of soldiers and unknown figures, ripped money, discarded packaging of Fujifilm, reproductions of well-known paintings, map fragments, play cards, key and keychains, and much more. The camera examines these pages for quite a while, shifts then for a bit to Misha's face, which we see is in the state of absolute enthrallment with his objects, returns again to the album, looking at a few more things, until Misha turns to a page that contains nothing but a list of names. These names, we realize, are film credits. To be more exact, they are the film credits of Второстепенные люди, the film we've been watching, informing us that Natalia Busko played the main character Vera, Philip Panov played Misha, and so forth. As Misha turns another page, we see more credits on display, and so it continues until finally all traces of the diegetic world vanish, the credits begin to roll in a typical way, and the film ends. In this concluding formal twist, Muratova's film shifts from being a representation of a world that includes Misha's album to becoming a part of the album, turning itself and Misha into yet another random scrap of the world that Misha has been obsessively collecting long before we got to know him in the film. In my talk today, I want to consider how we might understand this collection and this formal twist. Collections historically have been considered a project of an enlightened mind, a process by which the world is categorized, ordered, and becomes thus known. But such a definition does not account for extremely diverse practices of collecting, where, in the words of Roger Cardinal, who writes on the practice of modernist collage, quote, every acquisition, whether crucial or trivial, marks an unrepeatable conjuncture of subject, found object, place, and moment, end of quote. For Walter Benjamin, a figure of collector is intricately bound with the subject's experiences of modernity. The collector is someone who detaches an object, quote, from its original functional relations and places it into a magic circle where it can mingle with other things that it resembles, end of quote. Misha's collection in Muratova's film consists mostly, but not entirely, of discarded items, of essentially trash, and as such can hardly be counted as an Enlightenment project. Likewise, as trash, these items already are deprived of functional relations, of their use value, and thus not entirely in concord with Benjamin's discussion. If anything, Misha finds a new home for many of these things, thus saving them from oblivion and disappearance. Benjamin's understanding of the collection as a magic circle in which an object mingles with other objects that it resembles is, however, of relevance here, as we see Misha's pages filled with things that appear alike, and it is obvious that creating resemblances provides Misha with great pleasure. At the same time, some of the likenesses in his collection are very tenuous. If the album's early pages are filled with things that are obviously similar, here we can say it's all packaging, the object's commonality on other pages is not always easy to discern, such as in this image. It is, of course, Misha's consciousness, his mental and emotional predispositions that create the album, and thus it might be only he who is able to perceive what is here alike. But importantly, Misha's consciousness cannot be fully taken as the mastermind of the album, the kind of categorical umbrella through which all items could be rightfully placed, since he himself, his consciousness, is part of this album, as we see in the film's final twist. Misha, in other words, is just another item on these pages, playing his own small part in the magic circle of resemblances. He is not entirely in and not entirely out, but he is in some kind of collective relationship with these things. If the collection of objects and people is all about being together and having something in common, even if what is in common is not always clear, can we understand it not simply as a product of Misha's idiosyncratic mind, but as a form of community, of social organization. To discuss collectivity or community and the kind of wholeness and unity that such concepts usually denote might appear an obsolete task in regard to secondary people. Its narrative and visual organization barely hold at the seams, starting with one group of people and a set of motivations, only to shift to something fully different as the established protagonists vanish from screen and a new set of people with their interests begin to dominate the action. Even more directly and in explicitly social terms, a lack of communal wholeness is presented in the opening part of the film, set in what I assume is the newly built suburban Odessa. Composed of private cottages, cottage as they became known in the 90s, constructions that embodied the Soviet imagination of private property and wealthy people's lives and sprouted all over the former USSR, these suburban streets look more like ruins in the making. Full of unfinished structures and devoid of life, they are not an image of the prosperous community promised by liberal democracies. These streets offer no hope or ground for an emergence of a social, communal public space. When we see this neighborhood coming together, it is only in the form of a horde-like chase for an escaped pig, or in the form of a conversation of two women who, secluded on their individual balconies and never directly facing each other, negate with their spiteful exchange the possibility of a meaningful interpersonal communication. It is a sarcastic mirror of the immediate post-Soviet reality in which the unifying categories of Soviet collectivity fell apart, giving way to a free-for-all capitalism, which too failed to generate productive principles of collective communal organization. Considered in the context of Muratova's work as a whole, we should not be particularly surprised about the absence of such communal wholeness in this film. Nancy Condi has discussed this issue, observing, I quote, Muratova's resistance to the imaginary of belonging, which sets the stakes very high, disallowing not only the higher order collectivity of a social imagining, but by extension, the commanding heights of the human, dismantling boundaries distinguishing human from animals, the living from the non-living, the organic from the inorganic, end of quote. Indeed, the majority of Muratova's film expressed plenty of skepticism towards any category that would structure a whole and seek to subsume under its wing a diversity of human life. When there is a community in her film, it is frequently counteracted by a set of elements. In Brief Encounters and Long Goodbyes, for instance, it is the materiality of objects, of the built environment, that operates as friction, as a component that both generates the social whole and negates its enclosure at the same time, thus never allowing a unity of the Soviet organism to be completed. But the tendency in Второстепенные люди, I want to argue, is of the...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you please turn the pages a bit lighter because of the sound?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Excuse me. Yeah. Sorry to go on, please.
But the tendency in Второстепенные люди, I want to argue, is of the opposite kind. Precisely at a moment in post-Soviet history when previous models of collective formation had lost their conceptual political currency, the film explores different forms of collectivity, question how the we of a community might find an expression without abiding, however, to broader unifying categories. Or to put it another way, the elements that constantly called into question the Soviet social organism in Muratova's early works, these were secondary objects, those of lesser or no importance, become the foundation for rethinking forms of collectivity in this film. To discuss this, I want to take a closer look at the sequence that transpires in Vera's house. Vera is one of the protagonists in the first half of the film. Shown as an enclosed, contained space, separated from the outside by thick walls and a small, secluded entry door, the interior of the house, in a way that is typical for Muratova's films, presents a collection of diverse things, many of which, like in the case of Misha's album, come gradually into focus. We see here full-size reproductions of well-known paintings, such as Jean Etienne's Lyotard, 1745, The Chocolate Girl, several sculpture busts that reappear in different locations and from different perspectives, several mirrors, some in elaborate Baroque frames, and as always, there's a whole variety of less prominent objects, vases, ladders, clothes, newspapers, drapes, which never fail to assert their presence. To enter these interiors is to succumb to fluid relations of likeness that never allow the space to congeal as something stable or easily knowable. It is specifically human figures who, while moving around the house, constantly enter into relations of being like different things. Consider, for instance, the moment of Vera's passing the Chocolate Girl painting. She poses next to it for the long 28 seconds while chewing on her nails, her figure explicitly replicating the image. Or later, another character, the doctor, in a moment of contemplation, is shown as sitting back to back with a bust, separated by a sharp-edged mirror and appearing as the sculpture's living double. Or in the same image in the back, Vera is singing in a corner right next to another elevated bust, the two resembling each other. In all of these cases, a singularity of each body is questioned through duplications and seriality, although the duplicated figures never appear as exactly the same. The emerging likenesses, furthermore, do not point to any essential common features. We would be fools, I think, to try and discern some essential, deeply rooted ties between two figures that simply appear alike. Rather, it is the most superficial general outline, the pose or contours of the body that generate these likenesses. And in the fluidity of movements and changing constellations within the house, the film suggests that anything might look alike when properly positioned and framed, thus stressing an utterly contingent, non-essential nature of such commonalities. The singularity of an individual body is also questioned through fragmentation, which occurs in different forms throughout the sequence, from dismembered parts of a mannequin's body spread on the floor to a miraculous separation of the doctor's head by means of a skillful lighting. As the doctor sits down at the table and lowers his head, The latter disappears into a shadow, leaving his torso beheaded as emptiness completes the repeated half circles of his collars. And I circled it here because it's easy to miss. The dark circular shadow, which is his head, in the meantime replicates other circular heads at the table, his body thus again dispersed into a series of likenesses around him. Such moments usually do not pass quickly in Muratova's film. Observed mostly with a still camera, the mise-en-scène too remains rather still, with a minimal amount of motion taking place on screen. The shots last long enough to observe with precision what's in the frame, as if inviting us to ponder the meaning of the diverse constellations of likenesses. Roland Barthes, in a discussion of a very different time of film and theater, referred to such moments of pose, of stillness, of elevated gesture as a tableau, which he defines as a compositional whole, akin to an organic wholeness of the body and autonomous in its meaning from the rest of the work. Focusing on the overtly political cinema and theater of Eisenstein and Brecht, Barthes suggests that each shot or scene in their work constitutes such a tableau, the goal of which is to communicate an ideal, metaphysical, and ultimately political meaning. Looking at a woman tearing up her skirt to repair a tractor in Eisenstein's The General Line, for instance, Barthes sees her gesture as, quote, bearing the weight of history. It brings together the past victory, the present struggle, and the effectiveness of solidarity. End of quote. The woman herself carries no significance as a singular subject, as an individual. She is essentially a vehicle to make us perceive the ideal meaning, which would be the struggle for communism, the progress of history. But Barthes also admits that in the post-Eisensteinian cinema, here's his quote, it would not be difficult to find mise-en-scène marked by the dispersion of the tableau, the pulling to pieces of the composition, the setting and movement of the partial organs of the human figure, in short, the holding in check of the metaphysical meaning of the work, but then also of its political meaning, or at least the carrying over of this meaning towards another politics. Barthes essentially argues that the tableau has become a privileged form of expression in a society that believes in a unified political platform and invests in history as a political teleological progress. He couples the dispersal of the tableau in contrast with some other form of politics, another politics, as he says, the specific parameters of which he does not discuss. Muratova's secondary people, if they follow Barthes' classification, falls decidedly into the category of the post-Eisensteinian cinema. The film resorts to the form of the tableau, but only to deny an organic unity of its composition, showing instead its dispersion through the likeness and seriality of forms, and quite literally through the setting and movement of the partial organs of the human figure, as we see with the beheaded torso of the doctor. And with this, Muratova holds in check the metaphysical meaning of the work. Her dispersed tableaus don't invite to any thought of historical progress. But I think her moving images do point us to another politics, or could we say another polity. Although I'm hesitant to map Muratova's work onto contemporary political philosophy, her persistent recourse to random, unsubstantiated, surface-oriented likenesses, which I see as generative of something, has led me to the writings of Jean-Luc Nancy, and specifically to his rethinking in the 1990s of the meaning of community. Writing in the wake of the collapse of communist systems, Nancy examines just what might constitute an us in the world where categories of an overarching identification have become dysfunctional. He advocates for dismantling any kind of substantive community, seeking instead a form that would accommodate discording ways of being in the world, proposing a social formation defined through being in common, which he also calls as being with, instead of a traditional common being. Nancy writes, and this is a lengthy quote, the whole scheme of our culture knows very well what is to be in or out, to identify with something or to be totally exterior to it, to be homogeneous or heterogeneous. But to be with, this is the same thing as to say that the glass is with the pen on the table and that to be on the table is a way to be with. What is that? In a certain way, this is nothing because the glass and the pen have nothing to do with each other. So with implies proximity and distance, precisely the distance of impossibility to come together into a common being. This is the core of the question of community. Community does not have a common being, a common substance, but consists of being in common. From the starting point, it's a sharing, but sharing what? Sharing nothing, sharing space between. Muratova's infinite constellations of resemblances, not only in secondary people, but in many of her films over decades, might be grasped with Nancy's help as a staging and restaging of his being in common, of people and objects sharing the space and being alike without becoming one common being. Nancy Condi, not to confuse with Nancy, I turn once more to her discussion, argues that the appearance of doubles in Muratova's film points towards her dehumanizing project. What if, she writes, as in the freak show, the unique stable self were doubled, inverted, so as to deface it, end of quote. I think, however, that there is space to consider Muratova's likenesses as precisely a humanizing project, as a manifestation of an inherently human need to be alike and share, even if it's a sharing of nothing. When understood as such, Muratova's work concretizes what human attributes remain operative inside the community of being in common. Muratova stresses, for instance, what I could call for now a physiological sensory impulse to be alike. This would be one way to understand Vera's random, seemingly unconscious pausing next to a painting. She also emphasizes affectivity. Misha's face as he looks at his object expresses nothing but love, and it would be worth exploring further what and how he loves in regard to his collection. And Muratova also stresses the role of the material environment, her own glasses and pens on the table, to quote Nancy, inviting us to understand these objects as acting in their own right, as equal players that enter into and put in motion the evolving circle of similarities. What I think we can say with certainty is that the collectivity thus established is deeply entwined with the secondariness, vtorostепенность, within which Muratova's worlds revolve. Composed of the useless, unnecessary, and unproductive, her spontaneous groupings are liberated from any determinism. This secondariness is thus secondary to the first principle of community as determined by categories, which, however dysfunctional, continue to drive modern politics. In Muratova's films, however, the secondariness gradually takes over the whole, especially in this film, as Misha's mind and body, confined to a mental institution and thus most marginal of all, conjures up a community of likenesses, a magical circle of being in common, whose logic defies any simple categorization. Thank you.
Thank you, Lida. Move on now to our second speaker of the day, Lilya Kaganovsky. Lilya Kaganovsky is the Richard Margaret Romano Professor of Slavic and Comparative Literature at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her publications include The Voice of Technology, Soviet Cinema's Transition to Sound, 1928 to 1935, and How the Soviet Man Was Unmade, 3 edited volumes, and articles on Russian and Soviet cinema. She's a member of the editorial board of the Journal Studies in Russian and Soviet Cinema, and the associate editor for film and media at the Russian Review. And she's currently working on a book about Soviet women's cinema, which will include a chapter on Muratova. Her talk today is titled Mono Dia Polyphony, Muratova, Sound and Image. Lilya, you have the floor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. I wish it could have been all together and in person and in Berlin, would have been wonderful. But thank you so much for the organizers, and thank you everybody for coming together and doing this, because this is such a wonderful event, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. So as you know, as a year went by, and the title of the paper, of course, shifted a little bit. Still the same, but now, throwing in yet another term. I'm calling it dysphonia as an art practice. So I'll start. I have two clips that I will show as along the way, but otherwise I don't have a PowerPoint today. So in an essay on Billy Budd titled "He Stuttered," which was published in English in the 1990s collection of critical and clinical works, Gilles Deleuze distinguishes between the character who stutters in speech, and such as Herman Melville's Billy Budd, for instance, and the writer who, quote, is a stutterer in language. Coming back to his discussion of minor literature, Deleuze notes that even though Kafka is a Czech writer writing in German, and Beckett an Irishman often writing in French, they do not mix the languages together, not even a minor language and a major language, though many of them are linked to minorities as a sign of their vocation. Rather, they invent a minor use of a major language within which they express themselves entirely. They minorize this language, this is Deleuze speaking, much as in music, where the minor key refers to dynamic combinations in perpetual disequilibrium. So for Deleuze, this minorization exceeds the possibilities of individual speech, right? What the French call parole, and attains the power of language or langue. And it means, writes Deleuze, that a great writer is always like a foreigner in the language in which they express themselves, even if this is their native tongue, carving out, quote, a non-pre-existent foreign language within their own language, and making the language itself scream, stutter, stammer, or murmur. So what better way to describe Muratova's uses of stammer, accent, intonation, hesitation, repetitions, what we in fact might term dysphonia, in her films than through this idea of being a foreigner in your own native tongue. Her minorization of the major language, the dynamic linguistic disequilibrium, which is common to all of her films, starting with the very first independent word, that very first entry into cinema, the very first speech, which of course is delivered by Muratova herself, right? Дорогие товарищи, дорогие товарищи, дорогие товарищи, right? And so, right, so from Brief Encounters, I'll leave it as Brief Encounters, all the way to Eternal Return. Like Kafka, a Czech Jew writing in German, Muratova was, of course, a Romanian Jew making films in Russian. Russian was her first language, but what exactly is a first language for someone who was born in Bessarabia, right, now Moldova, who grew up in Romania, attending Russian school and watching foreign films, and who spent most of her adult life living and working in Odessa? So as Muratova herself put it in a 2004 interview in the Русский Курьер, quote, я после ВГИКа оказалась в Одессе, и этот говор меня заинтересовал как местный колорит. Все дело в том, что люди, речь которых отклоняется от литературного языка, ярче, чем литературно говорящие. Они первыми попадают в поле зрения и чаще выбираются в типажи. Они кажутся более правдивыми. К примеру, если вы дадите прочесть плохой текст заике или хорошему актеру, то заика покажется вам правдивее, потому что заикание будет заслонять неправду. Это такая обманка. So what lie does stuttering conceal? And is it possible to make language stutter without confusing it with speech, as Deleuze would caution us? After all, everything that I just said, Muratova's uses of stammer, accent, intonation, hesitation, and repetitions, applies to the uses of speech in her films, right? That is, again, parole, individual expression and production. But could we also see it as applicable to her entire cinematic language, just to say langue or langage, to the visual as well as to the auditory? That is what I'm going to try to do, to take this notion of the stutter as dysphonia, as a linguistic utterance that makes audible the materiality of language, its source in the body, the process of its physical production, as a metaphor for Muratova's cinematic oeuvre, as, quote, an effect of language, not an affectation of speech. So to do this, however, I'm going to first look at something that is in fact not Muratova, but Tarkovsky. And it's the opening scene of Mirror from 1975, in which the stutter, the stammer, the inability to speak, to produce fluid speech is tied directly and metaphorically to the notion of speaking with and in and through the body of the actor, the body of the character, but also the body of the film. So I will actually play the prologue. It's 4 minutes long. And of course, let me know immediately if you're not. So before we even get to the stammer, we might note already that the first sound we hear in the film, the television static, is itself a kind of placeholder or interference. In analog video and television, static is, or was, the random dot pixel pattern displayed when no transmission signal could be obtained by the antenna receiver or by a television set or other display devices. But static is actually noise, which is to say it's not image, but sound. The random pattern superimposed on the picture that is visible as a flicker of dots or snow is the result of electronic and radiated electromagnetic noise accidentally picked up by the antenna. Atmospheric sources of noise are the most ubiquitous and include electromagnetic signals prompted by cosmic microwave radiation or more localized radio wave noise from nearby electronic devices. But the display device itself is also a source of noise, due in part to thermal noise produced by inner electronics. And most of this noise comes from the first transistor the antenna is attached to. In other words, before picture and sound can be coaxed out of a television set or a radio, the device's own inner interference must be suppressed or muted. The noise of the world, cosmic background radiation, localized radio waves, the device's own internal electronics, must be silenced in order for proper transmission of the, in this case, televisual message to come through loud and clear. Similarly, the noise of the stutterer, the gulps, swallows, hesitations, pauses, and repeated sounds must be suppressed in order to produce fluid and coherent speech. In Mirror, the documentary episode of stuttering was initially meant for the middle of the film, but was placed in the prologue at the insistence of the film editor, Lyudmila Fignova, after which, according to her, the entire composition of the disparate elements of Mirror came together in a unified whole. This segment, viewed by Ignat on his television set, in this segment, the patient, Yuri Zhary, I think looking really uncannily like Sasha in Dolgi Provode, is cured of his stutter by the hypnotic powers of the doctor, who removes the speech impediment by first freezing and then releasing his body, and thereby liberating his voice. Yuri is first told to look straight at the doctor, look her directly in the eyes, to not take his attention away from her face. The camera tracks from left to right as the doctor's hypnotic stare makes Yuri fall forward toward her fingers. He's then told to stand with his back to the doctor as her hand, quote, pulls him back into the past, while the camera tracks out to reveal an armchair, an ornamental tree, and if we look very closely, the shadow of a boom microphone visible in the upper left corner of the screen, right? And this is when she says, "Ты будешь говорить громко и четко," right? You will speak clearly and effortlessly, not afraid of your voice or of your speech. You will speak loudly and clearly for the rest of your life. So I wanted to start with this scene from Mirror because to me it is the most memorable moment of stuttering in Russian cinema or Soviet cinema. And its purpose is both to showcase the affectation of speech, but also the affect of language. The boy's partial overcoming of his stammer serves as a metaphor, of course, for filmmaking as a whole, and for making this film specifically. This is Tarkovsky's own return to the past, from which he hopes to emerge speaking in a clear and distinct voice. Yet the film itself stutters, mixing timelines, fictional and documentary episodes, black and white and color photography, casting the same actors to play 2 or even sometimes 3 different roles. And finally, particularly in the scene's central episode at the printing office, the use of slow motion to delay the passage of time. All of these are techniques that work against smooth and effortless transmission of the film's message. They are the noise that gets in the way of direct speech. And indeed, not only did it take Tarkovsky nearly a decade to actually write, shoot, and edit Mirror, but of course, many critics and viewers found it incomprehensible, the very opposite of clear and effortless speaking. Famously, председатель Госкино Ермаш после просмотра, по словам Мишарина, выдержал долгую паузу и сказал: «У нас, конечно, свобода творчества, но не до такой степени». So this freedom of artistic expression that crosses all boundaries of propriety is, of course, what Muratova cinema does to a much greater degree than Tarkovsky, or at the very least, to a different degree. Because of course, Tarkovsky is not a minor voice speaking from the margins, right? He's very much at the center of the major language and cinema production. In Muratova's films, the stammer takes the form not only of actual speech defects and impediments, metaphorized here by Tarkovsky as an inability to tell the story of his past, but also formally through the repetition of words, phrases, entire speeches, and scenes. And it is this affect of language that makes it possible for Muratova to minorize the major language and to allow us to hear it as a foreign language, even when it is our own mother tongue. So one scene specifically I will show from Muratova, but there are many more examples that I think we can call to mind. But this is again from my favorite film, «Чувствительный милиционер». This is about 2 minutes.
Меня мама после 11 часов домой не пускает. Разрешите в таком случае переночевать у вас здесь, в милиции? Меня мама после 11 часов домой не пускает. Разрешите я переночую у вас, в милиции? Меня мама после 11 часов домой не пускает. Разрешите мне, пожалуйста, переночевать у вас в милиции. Меня мама после 11 домой не пускает. Так разрешите же переночевать у вас в милиции? Меня мама после 11 домой не пускает. Позвольте мне у вас переночевать в милиции. Я говорю, мама меня после 11, как правило, уже. Так все, домой не пускает.
Юра, иди погляди, там
так я у вас переночую.
Столько крови.
Я крови не видел.
Мама меня после 11 по Гринвичу домой не пускает. Мама моя после 11 меня домой не пускает. Ну, разрешите мне у вас переночевать в отделении. Ну, ж прекрасно ж было. Мама моя после 11 домой не пускает меня. Разрешите мне у вас переночевать в милиции.
So what is remarkable to me about this scene is not only the fact of repetition. We just witnessed, in the film, a similar theme and variation in the episode right before, right, which is «Собак развели, собак раскармливают, людям жрать нечего». Or even the number of times our minor character, our второстепенный человек, delivers the same line, which is 9. But the realization that in some sense what we're seeing and hearing here is a set of takes. Even if they're not exactly filmed as such. The actor is trying out his lines. He's trying them out on an indifferent policeman, but also in some sense on us. His address is to someone immediately left of the camera. An entire minute passes before we get the reverse shot of the policeman. Standardly, different takes of the same scene allow for the best one to be selected during editing, with subtle variation, slightly different delivery, position, attitude, the exhaustion or frustration of the actor, creating a difference within sameness, a repetition always marked by alterity, what Derrida would call the iterable. But in Muratova's case, what is usually left on the cutting room floor makes it into the film itself, one of the many ways by which the marginal or the minor becomes central in her films. And of course, Lida just talked about this as well. Here, all 9 takes are included in the film, the actor repeating the same line each time with slight variation of tone and word order on delivery. A different kind of cinematic stutter from Yuri Zharov, but affecting not only the body of the character or the actor, but of the film itself. And indeed, if we take this device all the way, then Muratova's final film, the 2012 Вечное возвращение, Eternal Return, is literally nothing but a kind of cinematic stutter. It is a series of screen tests with different combinations of actors delivering the same dialogue and playing out the same scene over and over and over again. The film is literally made from the stuff that was never meant to be visible, the screen tests that happen before filming takes place. It produces a system, to paraphrase Deleuze, that appears in perpetual disequilibrium or bifurcation, where each of its terms in turn passes through a zone of continuous variation, where the language itself, in this case, the language of cinema, begins to vibrate and to stutter. It is, as Deleuze puts it, quote, as if the language were stretched along an abstract and infinitely varied line. Or here's how Muratova puts it, and Misha Yampolsky yesterday quoted the same passage, but with a slightly different emphasis. As Muratova recounts, what she learned from working closely with the designer and director Rustam Hamadov was that, quote, a necklace shouldn't be filled with beads, but here and there, the thread should show through. That was a revelation for me, she says, like Newton's apple. I thought, that's how simple it is to show the construction of the world. That beads, it turns out, are threaded on a string. That's when I began to be interested in the external side, costumes, ornamentalism. And so what I want to stress here is the visible thread between the beads, that skeletal structure, as Yampolsky would have it, that peeks through that static or noise of the universe. Because in Muratova, the ornamentalism is as much auditory as it is visual, and it is tied to, as Irina Sandomirskaya has suggested, 70 years of Soviet ideology and its disciplining practices and the culture of the voice, right? Kultura rechi, the elimination of the non-standard or non-normative from Soviet speech. Muratova restores dysphonia to cinema, making audible and visible what is usually marginal and suppressed. She privileges the stutter over fluency, bearing the device, the exposed thread on which the beads are strung, and making room in her films for everything that has otherwise been excised from the world and from cinema. So we might notice Craig Dworkin has, following Deleuze, that everyone stutters. Statistically, between 7 and 10% of all speech is disfluent, with phonemes repeated, prolonged, distorted, suspended, or even at times not audibly produced at all. The ideology of transparent and referentially communicative language is so strong, however, that, quote, we tend to automatically overlook these disfluencies or not consciously register them in the first place. Indeed, communicative transparency has such symbolic force that we tend to forget the extent to which a range of corporeal opacities, this is Dworkin's language, are in fact a perfectly normal part of speech production. Quote, the intake and exhalation of air, the pull and swallow of saliva, disadhesions of moist flesh within the mouth, all the small percussive taps and clicks from the articulatory structures of the glottis, tongue, teeth, and lips. Such sounds are all necessary accompaniments to the normal operation of the gross physiological components of speech production: pulmonary, tracheal, laryngeal, pharyngeal, nasal, and buccal. Where does a voice come into being, asks Yoko Tawada. Perhaps a vibration is first created in the vocal cords, the palate on a person's tongue. But this is not yet a voice. Only in the listener's head is it constructed as a voice of a person. We hear selectively. We correct, add to, and adulterate what we are hearing. Otherwise, it would be impossible to understand the person speaking to us. We contribute to this process by bringing in our knowledge, preconceptions, imagination, and repressed thoughts. Thus every act of listening is already a dialogue, even before we open our mouths to reply. And Zara Abdullayeva seconds this, writing, quote, specifically about Muratova. Монолог – один из важнейших элементов художественной системы Муратовой. При всем том, монологи в сложной оркестровке и звуковой, а значит содержательной полифонии муратовских картин, играют еще роль арий, которые на разные голоса интонируют артисты за кадром, в камеру перед лицом слушателей, зрителей, партнеров. And she has the three of them kind of linked together, слушатели, зрители, партнеры. So paying attention to language when it stops producing clear and effortless speech and instead refers back to the material circumstances of its own production and allows us to hear the murmurs of its materials is what I think Muratova urges us to do. The stutterer, writes Dworkin, structures language in two opposing directions, both blocking certain speech and impeding the facile consumption of language, while at the very same time permitting or producing literary compositions based on its formal characteristics. The poem is free to be inarticulate, Peter Quatermain writes, even to stutter. Or, as Khlebnikov puts it in his essay on poetry from 1919, a poem, unlike a street sign, is not meant to be understandable. By smoothing out speech, by privileging fluency and suppressing noise, we erase the body of the speaker, as if the utterance could somehow exist without the one who utters it. Pauses between words are just as important as words, perhaps more important when dealing with notions of rhythm, the interval, as Zigovertov would have it, the negative space, the space between. In other words, Muratova's thread visible through the beads. Thus, when speech continues without communicating anything, when speech intransitively reaches the limit at which its communication becomes silent, only then, says Dworkin, can we hear the body speak. The body and its voice becomes the vehicle through which incoherent, disfluent speech with its pauses and silences is communicated. The accented, strangely intonated speeches that Muratova's characters deliver, sometimes over and over again, sometimes speaking in unison, sometimes in what she terms a harmony of chaos, alert us to the material production of speech, to speaking from the body. And it is here that I think we can also connect Muratova's cinema and its preference for stuttering and disfluency with modernism and the avant-garde, as I think so many papers this time are trying to do. And the avant-garde's broad challenge to the ideologies of normalcy, fluency, transparently communicative expository eloquence, and any notion of a dematerialized or disembodied language. As Nancy Perloff notes, avant-garde music and sound poetry emerged out of a common interest in incorporating sounds produced by new kinds of musical instruments and by virtuosic vocal techniques. Quote, this more inclusive content expanded the scope of each to encompass all sounds and challenge traditional distinctions between sound and speech, sound and music, sound and noise, and music and noise. And what I think the avant-garde poets understood and what Muratova understands is that language is in and of the body and that speaking and hearing are both physical acts. Quote, every voice from outside resonates within our heads, not before our eyes, writes Yoko Tawada. Quote, what is appealing about art is not achieving good synchronization. It is precisely through visible discrepancies that the voice gains its poetic independence. That's it, thank you.
Thank you, Lilya. Okay, so we're at this point opening up for questions.